My husband, Richard, always loved the finer things in life. Mansions, yachts, the whole 9 yards. When he passed suddenly last year, everyone told me I was set for life. Turns out, they were dead wrong. And the reason why? It was more twisted than I could ever imagine. The silence in the house was deafening. It had been almost a year since Richard passed, and while the initial shock had faded, the quiet still felt heavy, like a thick blanket smothering the life out of me. Richard had always been a larger-than-life presence, filling every room with his booming laughter and endless stories. Now it was just me and the echoes of his absence in this sprawling house that suddenly felt way too big. Everyone had told me I was lucky. Richard, my husband of 25 years, had built a successful business, and we lived a life most people only dreamed of. I'd never had to worry about money, and the future seemed secure. So when the lawyer, Mr. Henderson, called me into his office a few weeks after the funeral, I wasn't expecting any surprises. I thought it would be a formality, signing some papers, maybe discussing the details of the will. Instead, Mr. Henderson looked at me across his mahogany desk, his face etched with a kind of uncomfortable sympathy that immediately set off alarm bells in my head. "Margaret," he began, his voice low, "I'm afraid I have some difficult news." Difficult was an understatement. It turned out that Richard's successful business was more of a house of cards built on shaky foundations. Debts I never knew existed had surfaced, and the lavish lifestyle we'd enjoyed had been financed by loans and lines of credit that were now coming due. The inheritance everyone, including me, had expected was gone, vanished, evaporated into thin air. I remember staring at Mr. Henderson, my mind struggling to process the information. It felt like a bad dream, something I'd wake up from any minute. But the grim look on his face told me this was no dream. This was reality. My reality had just been turned upside down in a single polite conversation. The following months were a blur of paperwork, meetings with creditors, and the painful process of selling off assets. The mansion went first, followed by the vacation home in the Hamptons, then the boat. Each sale felt like another piece of my old life being chipped away. One person who surprisingly stuck around was Mark, Richard's son from his first marriage. Mark and I had never been particularly close. He was a quiet, somewhat brooding man in his early 40s, and there had always been a subtle tension between us. I think he resented me for marrying his father, even though Richard and his mother had divorced decades ago. But after Richard's death, Mark had been different. He started showing up at the house, offering to help with the sorting and packing. He'd bring over casseroles and check in on me regularly. It was unexpected, to say the least. "You doing okay, Margaret?" he'd ask, his voice surprisingly gentle. "As well as can be expected, I suppose," I'd reply, trying to sound stronger than I felt. "It's a lot to deal with," he'd acknowledge, nodding slowly. "Dad, he wasn't always the most forthcoming about things." That was putting it mildly. One afternoon, as we were going through some of Richard's old files in his study, I stumbled upon a locked safe hidden behind a bookshelf. I hadn't even known it was there. "Mark, did you know about this?" I asked, pointing to the heavy steel door. He looked surprised. "No, never saw it before." We tried to open it, but of course it was locked tight. I called a locksmith, and a few days later we finally managed to get it open. Inside, there were some financial documents, old insurance policies, and a few trinkets. Nothing that explained the missing millions. But there was one thing that caught my eye. A small, leather-bound journal. It looked old, the pages yellowed with age. I picked it up, my fingers tracing the worn cover. "What is it?" Mark asked, peering over my shoulder. "Looks like a journal," I said, opening it carefully. The handwriting inside was Richard's, but it was different from his usual bold script. It was hurried, almost frantic. I started to read, my brow furrowing as I deciphered the words. It was mostly filled with business notes, dates, and financial figures. But then, I came across an entry that made my heart skip a beat. Meeting with the investor went well. He's in for a significant amount. This could be the deal that finally pulls us out of the red. The date was about 5 years ago. The investor? Richard had never mentioned any major new investors. I flipped through more pages, finding other similar entries. Each one mentioned the investor with increasing frequency, and the tone shifted from hopeful to almost desperate. He's demanding more control. I don't like it, but I don't see any other way. Another loan. He's squeezing me dry. I feel like I'm losing everything. Who was this mysterious investor? And why hadn't Richard ever told me about him? A few days later, Mark came over again. We were sitting in the now sparsely furnished living room drinking coffee. "You know, Margaret," he said casually, "Dad always spoke highly of you." I raised an eyebrow, surprised. "He did?" "Yeah," Mark continued, looking thoughtful. "He said you were the best thing that ever happened to him. That you brought him a lot of happiness." And it was a nice sentiment, but something about the way Mark said it felt off, almost rehearsed. "That's kind of you to say, Mark," I replied slowly. He shrugged. "Just the truth." Then he asked a question that made me pause. "Did Dad ever talk to you about his business dealings? Any partners or anything like that?" I thought back to the journal, to the mysterious investor. "He mentioned a few things," I said vaguely. "Why do you ask?" "No reason, just curious," Mark said, taking a sip of his coffee. But his eyes flickered away, and I had the distinct feeling he was hiding something. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The missing inheritance, the mysterious investor in Richard's journal, Mark's sudden change of heart. It all felt connected somehow. I started doing my own digging. I went through more of Richard's old papers, trying to find any clue about this investor. I even hired a private investigator, a discreet woman named Ms. Davis, to look into Richard's business dealings over the past few years. Ms. Davis was thorough. She interviewed former employees, reviewed financial records, and pieced together a timeline of Richard's business ventures. What she uncovered was more shocking than I could have ever imagined. It turned out that about 5 years ago, Richard's business had indeed been facing serious financial difficulties. He had taken out a large loan from a private investor to keep things afloat. The investor's name? Mark, my stepson. The quiet, unassuming man who was now helping me sort through Richard's belongings. He wasn't just an investor. He was a major shareholder in Richard's company, and over the past few years, he had steadily increased his control, essentially taking over the business. But that wasn't the worst of it. Ms. Davis also discovered a series of complex financial transactions that had occurred in the months leading up to Richard's death. Transactions that seemed to have systematically drained the company's assets, transferring them to offshore accounts under Mark's control. The inheritance hadn't just vanished. It had been deliberately moved by Mark. The pieces started to fall into place. Mark's sudden helpfulness, his seemingly genuine concern, it had all been an act. He had known about the state of Richard's finances all along. He had likely even orchestrated the whole thing. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Betrayal. That was the only word for it. Not only had my husband left me with nothing, but his own son had systematically stripped away what little security I thought I had left. I needed to confront Mark. I needed answers, and I needed to know why. I called him, my voice shaking slightly as I asked him to come over. He arrived a couple of hours later, a concerned look on his face. "Margaret, is everything all right?" he asked, stepping into the living room. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "Mark, we need to talk about Richard's business." His eyes flickered nervously. "What about it?" "I know about the investor," I said, watching his reaction closely. His face paled slightly. "What investor?" he asked, feigning ignorance. "You, Mark," I said, my voice hardening. "I know you were the one who invested in Dad's company." He hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "Okay, yes, I did invest some money." "Some money?" I scoffed. "You practically took over the entire company, and then you systematically moved all the assets offshore." His eyes widened in disbelief. That's not true. Don't lie to me, Mark, I said, my voice rising. I have the documents. I know what you did. He finally dropped the act. His shoulders slumped, and the concerned look on his face was replaced by a cold, calculating expression I had never seen before. So you found out, he said, his voice flat. Found out? I repeated, incredulous. You stole everything, Mark. Everything Richard and I built together. He owed me, Mark said defensively. He promised me a share of the business years ago, and he never delivered. This was just me taking what was rightfully mine. Rightfully yours? I exclaimed. You waited until he was dead to pull this stunt? You knew I would be left with nothing. You were always provided for, Margaret, he said, his voice laced with a hint of resentment. You never had to worry about a thing. It was my turn. His words hit me like a slap in the face. The resentment I had always sensed from him was now boiling to the surface. He saw me as someone who had unfairly benefited from his father's success, someone who didn't deserve the life Richard had given me. Your turn, I repeated, my voice trembling with anger. Richard was my husband. We shared a life together. And you just took everything. He would have done the same for me, Mark insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. No, he wouldn't have, I said firmly. Richard loved me. Maybe he made mistakes, but he would never have deliberately left me destitute. A tense silence hung in the air between us. I could see the anger simmering in Mark's eyes, but there was also a flicker of something else. Guilt? Maybe. What do you want, Margaret? He finally asked, his voice low and dangerous. I want what's mine, I said, meeting his gaze. I want what Richard intended for me to have. It's gone, Mark said, shaking his head. There's nothing left. Then I'll find it, I said, my voice filled with a newfound determination. I will fight you for every last penny. Mark just stared at me, a cold smile slowly spreading across his face. Good luck with that, he said. It's going to be your word against mine, and I have all the paperwork on my side. He was right. It wouldn't be easy, but I wasn't going to back down. Richard might not have left me a fortune, but he had left me with something far more valuable, the strength to fight for myself. And I wasn't going to let his son, fueled by resentment and greed, take that away from me too. This was far from over. In fact, I had a feeling it was just the beginning. And I had a few ideas of my own about how to uncover the truth. Ideas that involved looking a little closer at Mark's own life, his online presence, and maybe, just maybe, finding some unexpected allies along the way. The game had changed, and I was ready to play. My mind raced. Mark thought he had everything locked down, the paperwork, the offshore accounts. But he underestimated me. He saw me as Richard's pampered wife, someone who wouldn't know how to fight back. He was about to learn how wrong he was. My first step was to delve deeper into Mark's life. While Richard and I lived a fairly public life, Mark was always more private. He didn't use social media much, or so I thought. I remembered him mentioning an Instagram account once, something about his photography hobby. I searched for his name on Instagram and scrolled through the results. There it was, a profile with a few hundred followers, mostly landscapes and nature shots. But then, I saw a picture that made my blood run cold. It was a photo of Mark standing in front of a sleek, modern yacht. The caption read, "Finally got my dream boat. Hard work pays off." The post was from just a few weeks ago. My dream boat? Richard and I had always talked about buying a yacht, but we never got around to it. Now, here was Mark, flaunting his newfound wealth. And the timing. It was too perfect. This yacht had likely been purchased with the money he'd stolen from Richard's company. I took a screenshot of the post and sent it to Ms. Davis. "Can you look into this?" I typed. "I think this yacht might be connected to Richard's missing assets." Ms. Davis replied quickly, "Already on it, Margaret." While Ms. Davis worked on tracing the yacht and its purchase, I decided to dig into Richard's old computer. He wasn't the most tech-savvy person, but he kept a lot of business documents and emails on his hard drive. It took me a while to navigate through the files, but eventually I found a folder labeled Project Phoenix. Inside, there were numerous documents detailing a new business venture Richard had been working on in the months before his death. It was a promising project, with significant potential for profit. And the key investor? Not Mark. It was a woman named Eleanor Vance, a name I vaguely remembered Richard mentioning. I found Eleanor's contact information and sent her an email explaining my situation and asking if she would be willing to talk. To my surprise, she replied the next day, expressing her condolences and agreeing to meet. Eleanor was a sharp, intelligent woman in her late 50s. Over coffee, she told me about her involvement in Project Phoenix. She had invested a substantial amount of money, and the project was on track to be very successful. But after Richard's death, Mark had contacted her, claiming that he had inherited the project and wanted to renegotiate the terms of their agreement. Eleanor had been hesitant, sensing something was off, but Mark had been insistent. He kept pushing for more control, more of the profits, Eleanor explained, frowning. He even tried to cut me out of the deal entirely. Did he mention anything about Richard's financial troubles? I asked. Eleanor shook her head. No, not at all. He acted like everything was fine, just that he was now in charge. It was becoming clearer. Mark hadn't just stolen the existing assets. He was trying to take over Richard's future ventures as well. A few days later, Ms. Davis called with an update. The yacht was indeed purchased using funds that had been transferred from Richard's company to an offshore account controlled by Mark. The paper trail was clear. We had concrete evidence of his betrayal. Armed with this information, I decided it was time to confront Mark again. I called him and asked him to meet me at Richard's old office building, which I still had access to. He arrived looking smug and confident. "What do you want now, Margaret?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. "I know about the yacht, Mark," I said, my voice steady. "I know you bought it with the money you stole from Dad's company." His face lost some of its color. "That's ridiculous," he stammered. "It's my money." "No, it's not," I said, holding up the documents Ms. Davis had provided. "This proves where the money came from. And I also know about Project Phoenix and how you tried to cut Eleanor Vance out of the deal." Mark's carefully constructed facade finally crumbled. His eyes darted around the room, a trapped look on his face. "Okay, fine," he admitted, his voice low. "So I took some money. Dad owed it to me." "He didn't owe you millions, Mark," I said, my voice filled with disgust. "You were greedy. You saw an opportunity and you took it, without any regard for me or your father's legacy." "Legacy?" Mark scoffed. "He was a fraud. His business was built on lies and debt." "That's not true," I retorted. "He worked hard and he built something real, and you just destroyed it." "I saved it," Mark insisted. "If I hadn't stepped in, everything would have collapsed." "No, you didn't save it," I said, shaking my head. "You stole it, and you're going to pay for it." Mark laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "What are you going to do, Margaret? Sue me? You don't have the money." "Maybe not," I said, a small smile playing on my lips. "But I have something else. I have proof." I pulled out my phone and showed him the screenshot of his Instagram post with the yacht. "Remember this?" I asked. It's amazing what people share online, isn't it? Especially when they think they've gotten away with something. His eyes widened in panic. "You wouldn't—" "Oh, I would," I said, my voice cold. "I'm going to share this with Eleanor Vance, with the creditors, with anyone who needs to know the truth about what you did." Mark's face was a mask of fury. "You'll regret this, Margaret," he hissed. "You'll ruin everything." "You already did that, Mark," I said, my voice firm. "I'm just trying to pick up the pieces." I walked away, leaving him standing there, his face contorted with rage. I knew this wasn't the end of it. He would likely try to fight back, to discredit me. But I had the truth on my side, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of hope. The next few months were a whirlwind. I worked closely with Ms. Davis and Eleanor Vance, sharing the evidence we had gathered. Eleanor was furious when she saw the yacht post and realized the extent of Mark's deception. She immediately filed a lawsuit to reclaim her investment in Project Phoenix. The creditors, armed with the information about the offshore accounts, also began legal proceedings. Mark tried to fight back, hiring expensive lawyers and claiming that everything he had done was legal, but the evidence was overwhelming. The Instagram post, in particular, became a key piece of evidence. It painted a clear picture of Mark's lavish lifestyle, funded by stolen money. The hashtag #living the good life ironically became a symbol of his downfall. The legal battles dragged on, but slowly, surely, the truth came to light. Mark's carefully constructed world began to crumble. He lost control of Richard's company, and the offshore accounts were frozen. The yacht was seized. As for me, it was a long and difficult process, but I managed to recover some of the stolen assets. It wasn't the fortune I had once expected, but it was enough to secure my future. More importantly, I had my dignity back. I had fought for myself, and I had won. The experience changed me. I was no longer the naive widow who had relied on her husband for everything. I had learned to be strong, resourceful, and independent. I had faced betrayal and loss, but I had come out the other side stronger than ever. I never spoke to Mark again. The bitterness and resentment in his eyes that day in Richard's office were the last things I saw of him. He had chosen his path, and it had led him to ruin. Life wasn't the fairy tale I once thought it was. It was messy, unpredictable, and sometimes cruel. But it was also filled with moments of resilience, strength, and unexpected kindness. Eleanor Vance became a good friend, and we even decided to move forward with Project Phoenix, which turned out to be even more successful than we had anticipated. Looking back, I realized that Richard's death, while devastating, had also been a strange kind of awakening for me. It had forced me to confront my own vulnerabilities and discover a strength I never knew I possessed. I had lost a husband and an inheritance, but I had gained something far more valuable, myself. And that I knew was a treasure that no one could ever steal.